Well, today marks 22 years since the coordinated hijackings and terrorist attacks on New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. For many Americans, that September morning 22 years ago is a distant memory or maybe even history.
But for many others, the pain is a constant. It's present always. Their stories are ones we cannot and should not forget. Here's ABC's Derek Dennis with more.
Last night, the tribute in lights shining upward during a test hours before the official tribute to the victims of the World Trade Center attacks 22 years ago today. Robert Gray worked for NORAD that day, monitoring U.S. airspace. He visited the World Trade Center site last night.
As we walked into this area, it made me start to weep.
2,753 people died in Lower Manhattan that day, and just this weekend, the remains of 2 more were identified by the medical examiner. 40% of those lost are still unidentified.
We saw this plane flying at a very low altitude, extremely fast, but was so low I could read on the fuselage the word American.
Joe Pfeiffer was the first fire chief on the scene. His job sending firefighters in to save lives, including his own brother, Kevin.
I ordered him, as I ordered many of my other fire officers, to take their unit and go upstairs to evacuate the building.
Kevin died in the collapse of the towers, but many others were saved by the men and women who rushed into those buildings, knowing they might not come out alive. James Brosey, president of the Uniformed Fire Officers Association, lost his father, a fire department lieutenant who responded to the scene. He died just this year from a 9/11 related cancer. 341 members of New York's fire department have now succumbed to ground zero related illnesses.
Unfortunately, the exposure of that day and the days that followed during the rescue and recovery efforts have really started to take its toll. My brother was also in the collapse at the time. He has some other debilitating side effects from that exposure as well.
For Robert Gray, reflecting at the site last night, the lesson 22 years later is this:
We need to be ready for anything.
The testing of remains all these years later is part of a solemn pledge to keep identifying victims for as long as it takes so that the families of as many victims as possible can have closure. ABC News Live will bring you coverage of today's remembrance services throughout the day. Derek Dennis, ABC News.
Local remembrances will be held as well across Metro Detroit today. In Grosse Pointe, members of the community will be gathering at the War Memorial for the service of remembrance. Grosse Pointe resident Brian Kaufman, whose office was on the 89th floor of the South Tower, will be giving remarks and reading names of the lives lost in the attacks. That will start at 8:30, and in Port Huron, the police department will be recognizing the first responders who lost their lives on that day. The remembrance happening at 9 a.m. at the International Flag Plaza. And in Rochester, a piece of the 9/11 Twin Towers is permanently installed as part of the Heroes Point at the Rochester Fire Department. A dedication ceremony will be held today at 5 p.m.